I will talk about Storybook and UI docs today. My name is Jeppe Reinhold. I am a software engineer at Chromatic, and I am a core maintainer of Storybook. What that means is that I work in the Storybook team in Chromatic. Chromatic sponsors the development of Storybook. We're a team of 7 people that works full-time on Storybook. So while this is OSS, like it's open source, it's not something that I do in my spare time. I just do it as a job, like you do. I'll start today by talking about why documenting your UI has value. And not just value for like, hey, we have a design system team, but for any company actually that builds UI, which I guess is most of you. Then I'll go into some patterns in some great ways that I found that UI docs can get good. And then I'll put those patterns in the perspective of Storybook, how you can do that in Storybook. And in the end, I'll also be looking at how you can structure your documentation to make it readable. And we'll also be talking a little bit about looking beyond Storybook, because Storybook isn't a tool for everyone. So there might be some use cases that you have that we don't support in Storybook. How many of you have heard of Storybook before? That's a lot. How many of you used it in a way where you feel comfortable knowing what it is? That's also a lot. I have an introduction to Storybook as well, so we just can get a clear picture of what it actually is. This is an engineer. He is super hyped because he just joined Bankdata. He is building investments stuff. I don't know what it's called. And he's just ready to get building, and his manager says, I need you to build a drop-down for me. And he's like, okay, cool, I'll do that. He doesn't have any documentation to follow, so he'll just do it, right? What he'll do, well, let's suppose he'll do this, is that he might re-implement some components that already exist in the vast code base that you have, because he doesn't know where to find the other components. He doesn't know that the search field already exists somewhere. Or he might not follow the style guide. You have your designers have put out that you need to use these shades of green, and he just uses the CSS green because that's what he got. He might follow this. Whoa. He might follow the style guide, but he will build it from scratch. He will use his own CSS classes or whatever, and not like make it like use the tokens you've already defined, because where would he find these? And he might also waste a lot of time asking his new colleagues for guidance, like, where do I find this component? How do I build it, right? Because if he can't read it, he has to ask for it. And so that takes up a lot of time for his coworkers. This is just for like a regular UI team. This isn't just for a design system team. Anyone can hire a new person, and onboarding this guy or this girl means that they'll need to read something. And if they don't have anything to read, they just have to ask questions. So that's a problem. I mean, that's super annoying. We have like 4 different implementations of the search component. The value of UI docs is it's more than just. I'm not sure how to put this, but my slides know. There are multiple values of UI docs. This gone. I'm gonna talk. Okay. Questions? All right. So you will, I think, we just the chord, I guess. You'll all get a shared understanding of how to use your components and how they are implemented. So this shared understanding, it doesn't live in the cloud, it doesn't in the picture, but it lives like in your docs. And whenever something changes, you integrate that into your documentation so that everyone can benefit from it. You get easier onboarding of new engineers. I just talked about onboarding. And they can feel like self-reliant which is super important. I felt, at least when I joined new companies, in that I myself can search for the knowledge that I need instead of feeling like an annoyance to my team members. It improves collaboration between teams, because you might work at bank data that has multiple teams using some of the same components, and one team says, well, I've heard over here that they have a search component, that's great, but if I don't know how to use it, I don't know. But if they have docs, then I'm more inclined to say, look, I'll try to use that, because at least then it's documented, and they've put some work in it that I don't need to do, right? It also facilitates adoption of your existing UI. It's a bit the same as I just said, but imagine that I lost my train of thought. Imagine that. No. Anyways, you have a set of UI components, and you want to reuse them as much as possible. It's easier to reuse them and adopt them if you know how to, right? So that's basically the core values of UI docs. So that was just like a quick rundown of why we might want to even think about this. Why would we write documentation? It's work that I could have spent on anything else. It also gives a reference point in that if you're using your component, say you have a button and you just put primary true, whatever, and then suddenly the button breaks, then you can go visit the docs and say, oh, well, they changed the prop, right? And then you can change it up. And I'll go further into more detail about resonance later in the structuring part. But that was how we do, or why we would do UI docs. For this talk to make sense in the perspective of Storybook, we need to talk about what Storybook is first. So we'll do a brief introduction of what Storybook is, and then I'll show some coding on how it works in action. So Storybook is a front-end tool for building UI components faster. It allows you to take your UI components and build them in isolation. So while you're maybe used to building within the page, you are assigned to put a search bar at the top of the page, you will add it to the page. That's a bit brittle, because it might be, you might need to use it somewhere else, where if you were building it within Storybook instead, it's in isolation. It doesn't care which page it lives in, and it shouldn't, because the search shouldn't know about it's where it lives, right? You can build up a catalog of all your components and the different use cases for each component. So it's a bit small. On the left, there is like a list of all your components, and then we have what we call stories, which are like implementations of the component, saying a button would have a story that could either be a primary story or the secondary story, because you can use the button in multiple different ways. It works with most major view layers out there: React, Angular, Vue, Svelte, whatever. And we have a thriving community with over 500 add-ons that allows you to build components even faster. So this is an example of a story file on the left that represents our button. On the right, you'll see how it shows up in the Storybook UI. The file, which is called button, is it big enough? I guess. Button stories is in a format that we call CSF, component story format. And at the top, we have the metadata for the component, which is the default export. And then for each export is a new story. So each export is a way to define how your component is used in that specific way. If we look at the primary story, it says, I'm calling it primary, and we have some arcs. And arcs is what you would normally call props, I guess. But it's called a lot of different things in different view layers, so we just call them arcs. And it's a way to say, I want to pass in the prop of primary is true and the label of button. And that combined will give you the button you see on the right, which has the primary blue color and the button label, right? And you can see that if we changed something, it would be represented another way within your Storybook, complete in isolation from anything else you've built. Storybook lives alongside your app. So you don't embed Storybook into your application, and it's not part of your production bundle, and your users can see it. It's something that you add next to your application that imports the same components that your application does. You can think of it as the way you run tests are also not part of your application. It's something that you have next to your application. What I've just talked about is how to build components in Storybook, but it's more than just a workbench. You can also write tests for your stories. I won't go into that today. That's another talk, testing entirely. And you can also write documentation within Storybook, which is, of course, what we're talking about today. So it's more than just a tool that you use behind the scenes. You might want to push this forward to any of your users or your audience, whoever that might be. Many great companies are using it. We have just crossed a major milestone of 20 million downloads a week. So you're in good hands. And it's been, I think it's 6 years that it's been developing now. So there's a cursor annoying my eyes. Let me show you what I just told you, but in real life. I have been struggling a bit with cramming it all into one screen. Can you see it, or do I need to go bigger or smaller, or is it okay? On the left, we have a live Storybook running on my local host, and on the right, we have an application with a lot of stories, right? And this is the story that I just talked about, the primary button, and we can see that I can rename the label and save, and it will be shown in the button. I can also change an arc to say size medium. I lost again. Okay. Probably because it's already size medium, so a weird example. Small would probably be better. And it changes, right? And of course this is code, so it lives on forever. You can also dynamically change these in the Storybook UI, but I'll go into that in a bit later. You add as many story files, one per component. I can use another chord, I guess. Like
I think it might be this one, so maybe.
Yes, I have one here.
I have one here as well. Oh,
The battle of the HDMIs.
yes. Thank you.
Excellent. And on the left, we have our component catalog, or sidebar, which you can cycle through all of the stories that we have, small and large and secondary. And we also have other components, a header component, and it can be logged in and logged out and whatever. And you can keep expanding on your component catalog by writing more story files. So that's like a very quick introduction to Storybook. It does a lot of things. Some would argue too much. But this is just the basic, right, to understand what it is. So this is a flyby of different patterns that you can use to build great UI docs. Some I've found, Storybook has we call it a component encyclopedia, where we basically catalog some of the great design system storybooks that are published on the web. You can visit our page and see this encyclopedia if you want inspiration for this, which is what I've taken here. So first up, when you're documenting UI, you're not just documenting components. You can't just add all the components you want and then write, because you will definitely need to have something that goes beyond the components. You need to introduce the user to what it is that they're seeing. This is a book, after all, or sort of, a storybook. They might want to know how to get started with using the UI library. Do they need to install anything? Do they need to set up their computer in a specific way to get this developed? And you might also want to tell them how they can navigate these docs. I mean, there are many things that you need to write that is not just for the components. And this might seem a bit obvious for some, but I've seen it a lot of places where they don't do this. And so they have great component documentation, but then you don't like have the full context or the full picture. And so don't forget this. You need to also, what I call it, write for your audience. So there might be many different users of your UI, and the documentation needs to support these, right? It could either be a designer that needs to see how things work, or it could be a junior developer trying to figure out how to make it work versus like a staff engineer that knows everything but needs to get into the reference details, right? So always ask when, who, and why. And when is about the situation that the user is in. Are you just starting out, or have you been using your UI for 10 years and need something else? Like, put yourself in the position of the reader, actually, here, is what I'm trying to say. There's also the design tokens to think about. When you build UI today, you're not just building components, you're also building these tokens, which are what colors are we using, what's the size of our padding and the border radius and all these kind of things. Those are important to have documented as well. You can't just say, oh, look at the button, look how round it is. No, tell me how round I need to make it. So you can do this in Storybook. Oh, sorry, one more. This is an example of a great introduction document in Storybook. It's from someone called Kickstart DS, where they're not just telling you how to get started, but also how to navigate the documentation. Here's where you find your page. I don't know if you can see it, but if it's too small. But there's a lot of components in the left sidebar you see, and they are telling you up front how to navigate those components. So this is a good example of how you can really spice things up. And to do this in Storybook, we have something we don't call it that, but it's MDX, that allows you to write plain docs without referencing any stories. You'll see this when you start up with your Storybook. It'll come pre-bundled with this configure project. And this is just a document in your code that you can change. So this is the configure MDX document that is, MDX is Markdown, but with React, usually React JSX. So you write your Markdown, but you can also import your components. And this allows you to basically add any docs page in your sidebar that isn't related to a component. What we would do is we would say, let's do a new file, and let's call it getting started. Hopefully, if we reload the Storybook, it shows up under Stories Getting Started. And that's because we're auto-generating the title here. And it's in the Stories folder. So it says, and then Getting Started. And we can do all sorts of things with the title. I'll show that later. But this is basically where you would write whatever you need, right? And this is text. And it shows up. That was a great example. We can also import our stories and show those if we need to. This is a bit beyond what I just said because I just told you about, well, this is about writing, getting started. Why would you import the button? But let's say you would need that. So let's import those. And we also want to import the canvas component from what I call, Storybook blocks. GitHub Copilot should know that. So with the canvas component, there are maybe 10 different blocks, but with the canvas block, we can put in our stories into the canvas. So we will add a canvas element, and it's a canvas of the button stories.primary, which will show the button in this beautiful little rectangle that allows you to interact with it. And you can keep adding whatever you want. And we saw the other page. I just showed it in a screenshot. You can add whatever style you need, or this isn't just text. You can build a web page in it if you want to. If we want to say, okay, it shouldn't be called stories getting started, we can set some metadata on this that we can set by creating the meta component. This is a weird component because it doesn't render anything, it just changes stuff. So we set the title to this, getting started. Storybook will say, hey, I can't find that story because you just moved it. So, but you can see here that now it's actually properly titled and it's not under that weird stories folder anymore. So this is how you can really define your custom docs. It's not component related. Then the next pattern is interactive component playgrounds. This might also seem a bit obvious for some of you that write stories, but what I'm really trying to do here is that the stories is also a big part of your documentation, and it needs to be interactive because UI is interactive. Screenshots will get outdated and stuff. And here's an example of an app we call Meal Drop that has a story for a modal. And many purists I've met out there say, my story should only show the component that it's using, right? But that's not always true. And I want to state that it's important because this modal also contains a button to open and close the modal. And that's okay, because sometimes you might need more context added to your components for them to be useful. I have this example prepared here. If we make it a bit wider. Yes. So using this as a user, or I want to understand how to build a model, it's way more, it's way better for me to see that it's a button that opens up something, rather than just seeing an open modal that I can't interact with. So make it interactive if you need that for the understanding. My good friend Jan, who built this, even went so far as to say, I also want to show how this plays up in mobile. So he used the viewport add-on of Storybook to say, shrink the size into a mobile view and show how it shows up there. So that's also a way that you can add more context to your story that your readers can understand. Verbose component descriptions. Oh, this is super small. Basically, we often fall into this pitfall. I've built this component now, I'm saying, oh, this is my button, that's great. But when your reader comes here, they don't get all the context that you know. They want to read and understand more. And my rule of thumb is that you can never write too much. Just always expect that your readers have no clue what it is that they're looking at. So add more descriptions to everything that you built. Adding descriptions to Storybook is interesting because you can do it multiple ways with comments. So if you go back to our Storybook here and we go to the button, what we're looking at now is what we call Autodocs page. We're going to do a bit of a detour now because I need to explain what Autodocs is before I can explain how to do descriptions. Basically, Storybook can generate documentation automatically based on your stories. We call this Autodocs, and this page is built by Storybook that contains the component title and then a playground, all the props here, and then even all the stories down below. And this is a great way to get started with docs quickly because you don't need to build this side up for each of your components. Storybook just generates them. If you add the Autodocs tag here. So I think if I remove it now, it should complain. It does now. So with these Autodocs, we can also add descriptions. So we see up here says primary UI component for user interaction. And this description is actually pulled from the actual button component. So here, the component that's been built, it has a JS doc comment that Storybook adds to the Storybook. We support Markdown, so you can do whatever. You can, I guess, you can add links and what you need. And this is really where I would urge you to document your components. There's this super annoying bug that Storybook doesn't pick up on these component changes, so I actually have to restart the server now because it's a comment. Don't ask me why. It should. Yeah, this is cool. The great thing about this pattern is that when Rasmus is building the component and he's making some changes, it's natural for him to also change the comment above the component because it's right next to the component, so he remembers to keep it up to date. And you don't have to both document your component for the builder of the button and for the user of the button because you write this in the same place. Not everyone likes that. Sometimes you want these comments for the button to be internal to the team that is building the button, and then you want to have some other description for the users of the button. This is not a common scenario, but it is a scenario. And the way we can do that is that if you write a JS doc comment on your meta here, we're now overriding the comments we saw at the button. So this is a way for you to have your comments separated and not being shown to your audience. It's up to you, whichever you use. You can't merge. This is about comment or describing your components, but maybe your stories needs a description as well, because maybe you want to say when this button is secondary, be mindful that it should only be shown in something else. I don't know. You get the drift. Basically, you can write comments above the stories as well, and it will appear in line with your secondary story in your auto docs. So this is, I think, is a fantastic way to just get started in writing docs. You don't need much more comments, and you can expand them as much as you want because Markdown supports HTML, so you can add like a details and summary and whatever. Cool. We're not just building components. Components have props. I mean, you use components by passing in props to them, and there are many ways to document how to use your component and passing the props in. Some use a table, some just write it out in line, some auto-generate some weird stuff that I've never understood. This is an example from, I believe it's from IBM's Carbon design system, which is of course also a Storybook. And they have completely written this props table from scratch. Most of it, at least, I know. But this is an example of where you can see each prop, a description of the prop, and then if there are any defaults set on it. And this is also super important for your audience to understand. And this is also where you need to be mindful of who is trying to read this prop table. Is it a new user or is it an experienced one? Do I need to write a lot about my props or write a little bit? These descriptions can also be auto-generated from your TypeScript types and have comments. Oh, that was not the plan. In Storybook, we also have a prop table. What's new? I know what's new. This prop table is interactive. It means that any user can try out your component by changing the prop. This will change we call it the main story on top, and it won't change the examples down here because they're supposed to be a static example of how to work. They're still interactive, but they are not reliant on these. So you can say, what if it was medium or it was large, if I wrote something else? So this is super quick and easy way for your user to try out different states of your component and how it behaves. And this is something that we've seen a lot of people be happy about and not implement just in Storybook, but in most other UI documentation tools today. You can, when you write your stories, we attempt to infer these we call them archetypes, from your component. Sometimes that doesn't work, and you can manually override them if you need to. Maybe you have an enum that is small, medium, and large, but you really don't want people to use the medium one. So you can define your custom size in your Storybook, and then say don't show the medium one. It's called archetypes if you want to search for this in the docs. What many users want is also copy-pastable examples. They want to see your component, and then they want to say, okay, I'm ready to use your search component. I'm going to copy-paste this into my code. And this is great, but there's a big pitfall here, because what we've seen is that when you do supply this, your user or your reader will think that it's flawless. They will copy-paste it into their code, and if something breaks, they'll be like, I have no idea what's going on. I have to call my manager. I'm not reading docs. The copy-paste didn't work. So, and this is true, and they back up. So confidence in your source code generation if you do this, because otherwise you might be making things worse. Storybook has a way to generate these for you automatically. It's not perfect one size fits all. It works pretty good with React, but with some of the other frameworks, there are still some things that you need to change yourself. If we go back to our autodocs here, we can show code for any canvas that will pop out and say this is how Storybook rendered the canvas. And as you can see, it has the live arcs. So if we change something here, it's also changed in the copy-pastable example. Right. Okay. So this is a great way, but please be mindful about this. If you get a lot of feedback that says this doesn't work for you, it might just be better to disable this, or to write a static source code example that you've defined yourself, saying this is how to use this component. Right, and this works, of course, for all of the stories, not just the interactive one. There's an anecdote here in that I want to tell you about co-locating your showroom and your workbench. I don't know if many of you have been to Bornholm, but these are pictures from something called Bolcheriet in Bornholm. They make hard candy, and I was there in the summer. Great place. The trip was too long. But basically what they do is that when you walk in the door, you're taken straight to their workbench where they're building up, or they're creating the hard candy, and you can see how they're molding it and whatever. And then to get out of it, you have to go through the shop to buy the candy. And I'm not saying you need to add a hard candy shop into your Storybook. What I'm saying is that I suggest that you keep your stories with your docs. We have a lot of users, I hear this weekly, saying, hey, I've built this great Storybook, I've written this documentation, but I don't want my reader to look at the stories. They're mine, they're my workbench, and they're ugly, and I have too many stories, they fill up the sidebar. And it's an attempt for users to try to make their Storybook pretty, to say, I only want the pretty docs shown. And you can do that in Storybook. We call it a docs-only mode, where you can compile it in a specific way, so remove the stories. But I don't suggest that you do that, because if the stories are valuable to you when you're building your components. They're also valuable to the users when they're trying to use the components. And so over here we have the stories, primary, secondary, and large. And these contains the same handles that you use when you're building these. So here we also have the controls, and we can have, I think we have an action hooked up here. So the action add-on allows you to get a log when something has happened, and you decide what is an action, what isn't. And all of this might, for some, feel like some work areas should be hidden away, but I really suggest that you keep it up, because your users are most likely also engineers, so they understand what this is. I mean, if it's because you have a very large storybook with maybe 50 or 100 components, and it gets really crowded in the sidebar, then I suggest that you split it up, because you yourself are the master of the structure over here. So you could have, like, at the top, say, these are my public docs. If you want to see the stories, go down, right? And then they can be collapsed or whatever. You can do that, but I don't suggest that you hide your stories. Then there's the issue of publishing and versioning your docs to match your UI components. There are a lot of ways to do this. This is a screenshot from the Storybook documentation. And we have this drop down that allows you to pick a specific version and then get the docs that matches that version. And that's okay. It's great for the user, but it's pretty hard to manage for us now because we have a lot of versions. And so whenever we are building a new this new docs page, we're building it, as you can see, 10 times, because there might have been some changes to what the docs should say in 6.0, right? So if you have a lot of versions, this is not what I'd recommend, honestly. Sorry. I've seen other examples where they document this prop. This is great. It was introduced in version X. So that way, a user that's not on version X knows that he can't use it, right? For Storybook, we have this great thing called Chromatic. And this is a bit of a detour to Chromatic. I won't talk too much about Chromatic today. But what Chromatic is that it's like, it's a way for you to test and to publish your storybooks. So you have Chromatic added to your CI pipeline. So when you run tests and you run your builds and whatever, you also run Chromatic. And then Chromatic will do a visual diff on all your stories in your storybook. And it'll say, oh, wow, this button changed 4 pixels. Is that okay? Or was that not on purpose at all, right? That's the main deal with Chromatic. You can disable all of this and just do the publishing part. Chromatic only starts to cost money to you when you start doing the tests, and we call them snapshots, these screenshot components. If you disable all of that and just keep the publishing part, you are actually publishing your storybook to a URL every time you run CI. And that way, you can have different versions of your storybook. So what this looks like in practice is, this is a list of builds. One build is one published storybook on the storybook design system. And we can see, you can't see that. It runs on different branches, and some of them have changes, most of them don't have any changes, so they're green, right? If we go to a specific build, we can view the storybook for that specific commit. And then it's just there, right? This is a public URL. Chromatic supports auth, so if you don't want to share this publicly, you can add auth to it, as long as you add a user to Chromatic, and seats are free in Chromatic. We don't charge for seats, so you can add as many users as you want. To get this working with publishing different versions, you need to do something manually, because Chromatic supports a specific. You can have a very static URL for a branch of your Chromatic build. So let's say if this is on the, I don't know which this branch is on. Let's go back. A master branch. So in Chromatic, we have these branch URLs which say, for this project, if you use this URL scheme, you can add any branch you need, and it'll always be up to date with your branches. So if you publish your versions at specific branches, you have a release 7 branch, a release 7.1 branch, you can imagine that you have a specific version of Storybook at each URL, right? And that's one way of publishing and versioning your documentation online. Then you would, in your SharePoint, intranet, or wherever you're sharing this, you would have a link to each release. Okay, that was a lot of talk. To sum it up a bit, some of the patterns that I've talked about today is that you can use Storybook to automatically generate docs from components and your stories. You can customize these auto docs. I didn't talk too much about that, but the page that you saw, you're free to customize however you want. You can define a global docs page that will put stories in another order, or always add a preamble or whatever, right? You can write manual docs with MDX if you don't want to use AutoDocs. Soon, you can write Markdown docs. We're announcing this at VidConf next month, so you'll be the first to know. And if you don't tweet this out, I'll be super happy. But this might seem like a small deal, but it's pretty big for people that don't like MDX or don't like React and just want something super fast. They'll be able to write in plain Markdown instead. And you can publish your storybooks easily with Chromatic, and it's free. Good. Okay, change of subject. Now you've written all your docs, for your components, for whatever, and it's great. It's a vast library. But if it's not structured right, your audience will not understand how to read it. You could either have it as a big pile or have it labeled and whatever, right? I'll go through 2 different frameworks that will talk about what you're building here in a way that makes it easy to understand. The first one is the Diataxis framework, written by this beautiful man, Daniel Procida. I believe he's CTO of Django now or something. It's mostly a framework for building technical documentation, not specifically UI docs, but just something technical. And it's a system that allows you to look at your documentation and see, okay, which areas do we need to improve on? Which parts do we have? Which kind of users do we support? So it splits up the documentation written into the user's needs. And as any great theoretical framework, it has the 4 quadrants. You can have that if you want to be serious. It's a bit hard to read, but it basically splits up your documentation or your user's needs into some that is studying or that is learning about the technical, or some that is actually working with it right now. And then it splits into on the other axis. It's about being practical and we are doing something, and then at the end is more theoretical, talking about how to use it, right? So it's tutorials, how-to guides, explanations, and references. And these are 4 very different things to write and to build, and your use case might need all of them, or only needs some of them. Maybe you don't need a tutorial because you're not hiring people in the next 4 years, right? You probably need references, unless you don't have any people working on your components, but then why would you even be here, I guess? It goes into way more detail. It's a page, it's a website, and also it's like a 2 hours read. I suggest anyone to read it. There's a lot of words here, but I want to focus on these 2 rows. In that, oh, that's unfortunate. The tutorials, they can teach people, and it could be like teaching children how to cook. How-to guides is about how to do something specifically. It's not just a reference, it's go from A to B to get to the end result. The references is a very specific list or a book of everything that you have that I can use. And the references in our Storybook examples would probably be the stories themselves. And lastly, there's these explanations, which most people forget, in that there are some users that say, that looks at your documentation and thinks, why do I need to add these props to the button? That's super strange. But most often you've done a lot of thought about this already. Write that down as an answer, so they don't have to ask these questions why. This is a funny. This was a great example I found while browsing the Carbon design system, in that at the end of some component, there's like, why do I need to do this specifically for this accordion? And I assume that they've been asked this question 10 times, and they finally just decided to write it down. It is about accessibility, and you have to do it in a specific way. This is just an example of why it's important as well. There's also another great example, which is the Quick UI framework. Quick is like a framework like Angular and React is, but they're doing something vastly different, and it's a really another mindset to understand. So they have to be very explicit in their docs for you to understand this grasp, because if you don't follow the methodology of Quick, you won't be writing any good components. And so they have all of these. They're teaching us how to get started. They have guides so we can learn it from A to B. They also have concepts that go into detail. Why is it like this? Why do I need to use the server component here when I should have used this instead? And then in the end, they have references. They do fall into the pitfall of references that I've seen a lot in their auto-generating all of the types from TypeScript that they have exported. And they just have like a huge list of types. And then you can click on it, and then you can see the type. I don't understand why they do that, and it's a very common pitfall, because who reads it? Anyways, it's a great. I read through this documentation from A to C, and it's really interesting if you're into UI framework stuff. Another methodology is the atomic design methodology. This is not specific to docs, but it's more about how you structure your components in your UI. Many of you know this already. Some hate it, some love it. I don't have an opinion on that, but it's basically a way for you to think about your components. Are they the tokens, or are they the atoms that are like the button, or is it like a collection of atoms? It could be like a search field, and use this structure in your Storybook sidebar, or whatever you're using to document, as a way to divide your components, basically. So it's understandable. Another detour. What's the time? Is it bad? Okay. We're often hearing about Storybook as a way to develop your components. Like, I know what about buttons, right? But it's actually also really good for pages. Many people don't know or understand this, but you can have a full page as a story and document how this page is supposed to be used. The meal drop application is a good example of that. As in, this is a zoom. This is like this is a story that just imports the category default page. It's mocking the server requests with mock service worker, and then it allows you to work on this page as a whole and see what's it like if we're loading forever. Then it will show up like this, right? This is some. Oh, you can't see that. They're loading the gray, but the projector doesn't show them. Maybe this one is better. Yeah. Anyways, so think about that as well. Storybook is not just for the leaf components, but also for bigger pages. Right. So that's another way to structure UI docs. Brad Frost, the original brain behind Atomic Design, and I suggest that if you want to read up on this, read both, because they're like the second one is 6 years later. Oh, I forgot tokens was a thing, and so you added tokens to the methodology. All right. I've talked a lot about Storybook, how you can use it, but sometimes Storybook is not the right tool for the job. Sometimes you need something very specific that Storybook can do for you. I know that bank data is documenting their design system in a completely home-built site that I've heard they hate. No, but you can do that, of course, if you want to. Some reason for why you want to do that is if you have complex, or if you need complex or flexible navigation. You've seen the Storybook sidebar many times now. If you need something more than that, then Storybook might not be the right tool. There's a lot of docs pages that have like 2 sidebars. One is like the overall, and then on the right, you'll have the specific headlines or whatever. We have something similar in Storybook, but you might need something that's more complex than that we can't give you. You might need fully custom branding or styling of your docs if you have a designer that says it's super important that these documentations use the right green. Storybook does support theming, and you can have like brand colors and change the style of your Storybook, but it's not like a full theming system. You can't set specific border radiuses on components and stuff. So this is a bit limiting for you if you need this. There's a lot of places right now that have live code editing. We've seen the source code snippet that I showed you. You can't edit that. But some feel that that's super important for them to do. So they want to have a code sandbox embedded or whatever. And while there are some add-ons that support this from the community, none of them is something that I would like, yeah, this is the one you should use. So if you need this, you might also need to go outside of Storybook. Or if you just hate React and MDX, this is no joke. There's a lot of users that does hate that. So you just build something on your own then, which is fine if you need that. A great example of something like this is the Skeleton UI. Skeleton is a UI library, and it just looks absolutely gorgeous. There's like 4 different themes you can choose, and you can also see usages and props, and you can do live editing, whatever. And so this obviously has taken a lot of time to build. I've seen the code here, and it's all homegrown. They're taking no tools off the shelves. They're building this from scratch. And this is what you need to do if you want to do that. You don't get auto docs here, right? So you're in deep water, which is okay if you want a really, really great experience for your users. Recap, I'm almost done now. I've been talking for a long time. UI docs are super valuable. They're super hard to build because you have different audiences and you might need different levers for different people. Take that into consideration. The structure is important. Go check out the diataxis and atomic design. Storybook can make your life easier and make it easy to get started, basically, and get a quick auto docs going, or manually docs if you need to. You can get started today if you use the npx command init. Run that in your project. It will set up Storybook for you and figure out, oh, he's using Angular. I'm setting these things up. The example I've shown you today is just me running Storybook in a React project. I didn't do anything else to set up these button stories. We have tutorials. Join our Discord and check out the videos we have on YouTube. They're really great. I don't know if you know Michael Chan from the Good Old React podcast. He's building these videos right now. And we have a great library of just like 6-minute videos to understand all these concepts. So check it out. I think it's great, and it's free, of course. Done. I have no idea if I went over time. I'm open to any questions, not just docs, but also Storybook or open source or whatever you want, I guess.
You can have 2 minutes or 2 questions for 1 minute.
So what if you are not building a UI library, but I'm building a CLI or an SDK with some functionality, and I want to document that? Would Storybook be good for me?
So the question is, could you use Storybook for anything other than UI? And you can. I've seen people like have their CLI running in Storybook. That's pretty wild. But I think you would probably just be better off using Gitbook or any of these other starter templates. Astro just created a starter template for technical docs, so that might be better.
Derek?
Yeah. Before I ask my question, there's a preface that I think your team did an amazing job from version 6 version 7. Huge execution.
Good. That was also where I joined, so that's probably that.
Yeah, awesome. My question is that whenever you try to supply a same object as an argument, right, the editor just chokes out because it spits out raw JSON.
Uh-huh.
Is there any future plan to make it more user-friendly?
There's no, okay, so the question is, what if I have an arg that's an object? I don't want to edit it as an object. I want a nicer experience in my controls panel. And it's a request we've had a lot. There's nothing planned right now. You can specify it manually in Archetype, and I'll love to show you afterwards how to do that if you are okay with the manual work it needs.
Awesome. That was 2 questions. So give it up for Jeppe.